Eamon, we're going to talk about the little-known Robert Noctor, who sort of came into your zone because of cab cases where he was mentioned to do with Encrochat phones and his relationship with a Kieran O'Sullivan, who has been working for the Kinahan Cartel for years as a conviction going back to when they sort of set up down in Spain. I think he was caught with cannabis at that stage and got 4 years in prison down there. But he's been right in the heart of the Kinahan organisation and is seemingly a very, almost like a son to Christy Kinahan Sr., or was seen at that, certainly. He was very, very close to him, and something which may have sparked jealousies between himself and Daniel Kinahan over the years. But nonetheless, Robert Noctor is what many people, anyone who might have known him, would have thought he was just a regular barman working in Dublin.
Yeah, and he would have worked in a couple of well-known places, like, in Dublin city centre and, and further out, like in North Dublin. On the face of it, somebody actually used to work and said he was great at maths, and, he was an absolute professional. People had, no problems, did a good job in what he does.
Yeah.
Involved in the bar and catering trade, that sort of thing.
Was living out in Clontarf.
He was living out in Clontarf, living now in Wicklow, County Wicklow, and the eastern part of it, in Blessington area. So he's actually back in Ireland, which our colleague Ken Foy discovered just recently, that he'd moved back a couple of months ago. Now he's not facing any charges in Ireland. He's never been prosecuted for anything, and I suppose the reason his name has cropped up is because of the cab case against Sam O'Sullivan. In which they were seizing, various bits of equipment and some money in bank accounts and so on. And we got some interesting stuff about, his lifestyle, sending the kids to private schools and all that sort of thing. But Robert Noctor was also mentioned in that as well. And also the fact that there was a cab case against Robert Noctor himself. And so there was some details as well about the case against Robert Noctor. We went back and had a look, and that would have the cab case was 2020, but it stemmed from his arrest in January 2020, which I suppose was a significant time for Encrochat, because this is now the go-to encrypted mobile phone communication system used by serious gangland criminals worth their souls, paying whatever it was, 1,500 quid a month. Or 1,500 quid every 3 months, I think, and
for the app and the phone, or the phone with the app on it,
and a mixture. Yeah, I'm sure the prices varied between the different suppliers.
Yeah,
like we know that. Well, I suppose to go back to January 2020, he was seen driving erratically in a Toyota Yaris in Artane. He was pulled by a Garda who found that. He was quite nervous and evasive, and then mentioned that, there might be some money in the boot, and he thought it was between something like between 100,000 and 140,000. He said he wasn't sure, and it turned out to be 93,300 odd, thereabouts. But the guard also found 3 mobile phones still in their boxes, and he recognised them to be Encrochat phones. Now, these were Android phones. I think one of them was a BQ Aquarius. And they were some of them were disguised, or the stickers were there to be able to disguise and make them look like an iPhone. For whatever reason, that was kind of deemed necessary at the time, I suppose, to try and, to throw a casual observer off, thinking that they're not necessarily using an Encrochat phone. And these phones, I think, as you've explained before as well, have it's like 2 sides to them. You open it in a certain sequence, and you just get an ordinary phone. You open it in a different sequence, you get the Encrochat, and has no microphone, has no camera. But somebody, casually looking at it wouldn't know that. And as far as they were concerned, then they had, and at this stage in January 2020, they did have a fully encrypted mobile phone service where they could text and they could send messages to one another.
60,000 criminals in total were actually using these phones across Europe. In January of 2020, to set the scene, Gardaí in Ireland and police in the UK and various other countries had been finding these phones in the course of their searches, and sometimes when they stopped known criminals. They knew there was an encrypted service, but there was little they could do. But behind the scenes in January of 2020, the French police had discovered the server for these phones, which is kind of like the HQ where all the messages are transferred through and that encryption process happens. They were in touch, the French, through Europol, with their colleagues in the Netherlands who've had the most success really in hacking these devices. And a plan was underway to basically send out a update message to all these phones And the plan was that those people who accepted the update, the same way as we'd get on our own phones and, devices, usually you get it at night and you accept and you wake up the next morning and you've got all the new bells and whistles on it. The plan was, if they accepted, then Europol police forces were going to be able to listen in live to these phones. Now that worked, and by April they were up live on it. But in January, the criminal underworld was carrying on regardless, no idea that this was happening or was coming at them. And Noctar's found with these 3 phones. He's later then linked to Kieran Sam O'Sullivan. We'll go through a little bit of his background in a moment. And they're seen as the sellers of these phones. They're actually going out and selling them into the underworld. And in France, O'Sullivan and Noctar are doing their dealings in France.
Yeah, and Poland was mentioned as well. As one of the areas where they offloaded some of these. I mean, when he was stopped at the time, like he was telling the guards that people were paying. They were paying a hefty enough fee.
He told the guards he engaged with them in relation to the phones?
Did. Yeah, now, this is when he was kind of caught, I suppose, he was caught red-handed. This is, driving the Yaris in Artane. And he was saying that each of them, they were sold for 1,500 each. And then there was the update was the top-ups or the updates were 600 quid. And it was depending on, I suppose the different third parties, whether it would be monthly or every 2 months or 3 months. But he said, but he had this 93,300, and he claimed that he was getting paid like between up to 1,500 for doing this money runs, where somebody would give him the money, he'd leave it in his car parked on the quays in Dublin, and then drop it to somebody at a filling station in North County Dublin. And he said he'd done it 4 or 5 times, and he was
trying to explain where the cash had come from, and I suppose to point out that it wasn't actually illegal to be selling these phones or to be dealing in these phones. There was no legislation there to say that was illegal.
No, absolutely not. No, and I mean, and the Encrochat marketing at the time, it was saved for celebrities who wanted to, be sure that their messages weren't being eavesdropped by the paparazzi or horrible journalists like me and you.
Yeah.
But it's quite obvious that as well as people who have that kind of cash who are able to pay for are going to be either one, celebrities who are having an affair with someone they shouldn't be, or somebody in a wealthy business background who shouldn't be having an affair or something like that, or criminals.
Well, what was ultimately discovered really was that it was pretty much 100% criminals were using these phones.
Exclusively criminals that were using it, and that stuff and that the Dark World, was it called? The documentary on Channel 4 was absolutely terrifying when, and I think it unnerved the police in the UK and I'm sure in other countries when they were getting these messages and seeing what was being planned. There was people, trying to hand out contracts to have people blinded with acid, people shot. There was a list of, heavy armory, like, heavy guns that were being offered for sale. And they didn't know who these people were because they were using, one of the things was the use of the handles or the nicknames. And some of these have been coming out. And so we know that Left Bay and Shamrock are Noctar and Sam O'Sullivan. But when he was caught in January 2020, there was said that there was some of the stickers, there was stickers and numbers handwritten on the rear of the stickers with the names. So these are the nicknames. So he had Big Will by 3. So presumably somebody called Big Will was getting 3 of these phones so he can hand them out to associates and Suave Suit was getting 6, Some Fire another 3, Royal Suit by 6, and Sword Nose by 6. So that's, if you add it up quickly, is 25 phones. Like that are in one drop. That's there's an indication there of the scale, that was already in Ireland being used. So, I mean, if you have 25 individuals that are involved in, and this is the high end of organised crime. These aren't the guys who are being asked to go and rob a car and leave it somewhere that can be used by someone else. These are the people who are making direct contact with people in Holland to buy, I don't know, 10 kilos of drugs and a couple of guns, or they're making direct contact to people in, Slovakia or in Spain. They're talking to the main guys in all the main gangs in Ireland. So it's not small time. So this is 25 senior high-level gangsters are represented by these handles, these nicknames, which, of course, I did a quick Google to see if any of them have turned up in any court cases yet, and as far as I can see, they haven't, but they might yet.
They might
more
yet,
than
exactly.
Left Bay and Shamrock have been identified. We'll start seeing, hopefully in the future, we'll figure out who's who.
So now, in 2020, January, he stopped with these phones, and the money, it's seized, and a Criminal Assets Bureau proceeds of crime case begins against him, which he doesn't ever contest. He never really seeks to fight for that money.
No, he not only that, but he never made contact or responded to the guards again. The money was in a brown Thomas bag in the back. It was wrapped up in 9 bundles. It was kind of in different denominations. Most of them were 50s, but there was 20s and 5s and 10s in there as well. Yeah. It's a bit unusual in one sense, and it was quite an odd number as well. It wasn't exact. It was 93,390.
So when that comes to court and the Criminal Assets Bureau seek to legally sort of keep that money as such, is his connections to Kieran Sam O'Sullivan mentioned?
No, at that stage he said he was selling them on behalf of a third party, who he wouldn't mention. But then I suppose in the more recent cab case against Sam O'Sullivan, it was mentioned that Robert Noctor was selling these on behalf of Sam O'Sullivan. And there was a close link there as well, in that Robert Noctor's ex-wife was at the time of the raids that were then carried out against Sam O'Sullivan. He was now with Noctor's ex-wife, was his partner. And this would have been, the raids that were carried out then were in June of 2020. So it was after the information that had been downloaded, I suppose, by the NCA in the UK, the National Crime Agency. And basically this money laundering operation involving a Chinese gang were identified, and Sam O'Sullivan was identified as being a player with them, in the sense that he was possibly a customer, or maybe working with them and aiding what they were doing, or finding customers for them. It's not really clear, but he also was found with multiple phones and multiple pieces.
So in June of 2020, the Criminal Assets Bureau make moves against Sam O'Sullivan, who's at that point living outside the country, or is he in the country?
No, he's still in Ireland at that stage. If you remember, like he was using a relative's house in South County Dublin, but there was also an address in County Wicklow.
Was that in Pleasanton as well?
Yeah, it's the same address.
It's the same address,
yeah, as far as I know.
Yeah,
and he's I suppose that what was interesting, I think, about when you kind of got a close look at some of the affidavit evidence and the belief evidence about Sam O'Sullivan and his links to criminality. 20 years ago he was being arrested with Bernard Clancy, who was like a key man in the Kinahan cartel,
sanctioned.
Yeah, but it goes back a long way. So it just shows you that O'Sullivan goes back a long way as well.
O'Sullivan seems to have. So he didn't grow up with the sort of structured Kinahan organisation, nor did he grow up with the Hutch crew. So he would have been a bit of a cuckoo in the nest, a little bit like Christy Kinahan himself, a middle-class boy from South County Dublin who seems to have got in tow directly with Christy Kinahan in Dublin along the quays, probably in those days where, E-tabs, ecstasy, and all of that was a place where you could mingle, mix, and make connections. He, by the late 1990s, I would have thought nearly 2000, he's in Spain. He's down in Porto Banús. He is, meeting and greeting others that may be sent down there by Christy Kinahan. He's there before Daniel and Christopher Jr. move out there. And he is caught up with 3 others around 2004, I think, with a consignment of cannabis. One of them is an English guy, and others are all connected to the Kinahan organisation. They get 4 years in prison. They're convicted in relation to that. Kind of unusual, actually, for the Spanish to jail anybody for cannabis. They tend to just give you a rap on the knuckles for that. Things were probably different back then. But he sort of then comes out of that jail system and goes very deep and dark within the Kinahan organisation. He's not one of the Fat Freddies, one of the Liam Byrnes. He doesn't have that sort of obvious swagger and would probably pass as just a regular guy.
Well, he's hardly passing as a regular guy when he's sending his daughters to Swiss finishing schools. at considerable expense, which
And
again
he's up
was
and
money
down
that
in
was
Geneva
tried.
a lot, isn't he?
And he was in the likes of Las Vegas for the Mayweather fight and with Conor McGregor that time, and he was in Azerbaijan just a couple of weeks before Bob Arum and Daniel Kinahan had their meeting. So he's playing a role, no doubt, within the cartel. That is a senior role. I mean, he's not going to be mixing with, I suppose, the likes of Fat Freddy if you're sending your kids to expensive schools in Switzerland, and he's set himself apart. Like he's on I suppose an executive as opposed to a grunt in the trenches working away the hard way.
When the Criminal Assets Bureau target him, he's back in Ireland. He's living in Blessington, but he also has the use of a relative's house in South County Dublin. They move in and raid those premises along with some business premises in South County Dublin, a takeaway, I think a Chinese takeaway and other businesses. In June, is that a direct reaction, do you believe, to the Encrochat material, which we've spoken about has been disseminated into Ireland, but has only been held as intelligence and not been sent on down? Or are the Criminal Assets Bureau already looking at him in advance?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, but it came at the same time that everyone was moving across Europe, and this was a Chinese money laundering operation that was put under surveillance, and Sam O'Sullivan came out of that. So it wasn't necessarily an operation targeted directly at him, and and it wasn't necessarily. I mean, they would have known already about the potential connection with Encrochat there, having whatever it is 6 months earlier. Arrested Robert Noctor. So, I mean, we're kind of putting two and two together here. And when they went into one of the residents that O'Sullivan was using, so they found 34 iPhones, 18 Google Pixel smartphones, 10 Samsung Galaxy phones, as well as a Rolex watch, a 1 ounce gold coin, and all this kind of stuff, and $3,000 in cash. But a lot of it was, it was very much aimed, it was without a doubt aimed at the Encrochat market, that they were still, or they still had the phones, hadn't got rid of them at this stage, and whether or not they were still sending them or whether this was old stock at this stage, we don't know. But it was very much, but it wasn't a matter that he got into criminality because of Encrochat. It was actually the other way around. It's because he had so many contacts and was so good, I suppose, at talking to people and a good salesperson that he was the perfect man to spread Encrochat phones, certainly among anyone with, that the Kinahans wanted to do business with. They were going to want to contact with people, at a business level, at a serious level. They want to do it through a secure system. And who better than someone like Sam O'Sullivan to do it for them.
And we can presume at this stage that, given his connections with Switzerland, etc., he has good French. So he's showing up then as this Encrochat story begins to emerge really over the last 5 years, and journalists in various countries have been sort of digging into what's been happening in their own territories. In France, an investigation finds that Sam O'Sullivan is living in the Alps and is one of the key sellers of the phones into that French network.
Yeah, there was a couple of hundred, wasn't it? It was like 200 customers that they had in France, which again is, I suppose in the scheme of things in France may not be that big. But if you're talking about 200 serious players, again, you're talking about, you are talking about millions and millions of euro worth of cocaine or drugs being moved, along with all the ancillary threats and intimidation and
it's a kind of nice way to keep your hands off, though, isn't it? The sale of phones as such, and that Encrochat app was not illegal.
Yeah, it is, but I mean, it's a means to an end, though. If you're making, it doesn't matter how much money you're making money off these phones. It's pennies compared to what you're making from a single kilo of cocaine. So that's why the drug dealers loved it so much. I mean, it was a minimal cost, and they trusted it so much they were entirely casual about the information they put on it. There were obviously versions where initially some of the phones didn't have, microphones and didn't have cameras, but then they did. And they were sending pictures of where they were and pictures of their dog in one case with the mobile phone number in case the dog got lost on the collar.
Right.
So, there's stuff like that. They weren't treating it with, I suppose, their fieldcraft, their spycraft wasn't quite up to standards, but they just trusted it so much. And it looks like, I mean, it looks like this stuff is going to be coming out for years to come. It really does. I mean, if you think it was literally a 74-day period where they were looking at these messages. Now, if you remember, they weren't actually getting them live. There was a bit of a delay because the booby trap that was sent out in the update was actually just capturing the messages before Encrochat actually encrypted them and sent them to their server. So they were getting an unencrypted version of the message, but there was often, a 24 and a 48-hour delay.
Was that throughout?
I'm not sure, but certainly at the beginning it was definitely, there was a 48-hour delay, and that caused a lot of anxiety, I think, when they realized in one case that an unexploded hand grenade was like sitting under a bush ready to go off at any moment, and they realized that had happened 48 hours previously after they were alerted about it.
So where's Kieran Sam O'Sullivan now?
Good question. And have we got a picture yet?
No, but we're going to get one. Because, of course, everybody comes home, don't they? Because
well, they do. And I mean, the chances are, like
Robert Noctor is back in Ireland. He's clearly he's not worried that he's facing any criminal charges.
And I mean, and he hasn't committed an offence. Like, in terms of, he was caught with money and phones, and no criminal charges were brought against him
and he just
at the
walked
time.
Away.
And he walked away. Yeah. So I mean, there's nothing there. I mean,
did Sam O'Sullivan contest anything in the Criminal Assets Bureau case?
He hummed and hawed a bit. Like he was initially, it was said he was in Spain, but they said they didn't know that. They had an email for him, so they were allowed to serve him legal notice of proceedings, like via email. A relative had said they got one phone call to say that he wasn't going to come back and he wasn't going to contest it, and then an email would appear the night before. Cab were going into court, and things would be delayed again, or they'd wait and see. And then he'd say he was giving up, and then say no, he was going to contest, and then eventually he said no, he was giving up. And I think Judge Alex Owens then kind of said, yeah, fair enough, and that was it. That was the end of it. And some of the money,
it probably wasn't worth it for the publicity for him. He has remained under the radar as such, somewhat. Kieran Sam O'Sullivan, and just to explain, his name is Sam O'Sullivan. Yeah, the Kieran bit comes in because in those early days when the Kinahan cartel moved to Spain, they all chose a different first name to use. So you always introduced yourself. I could have been, Hannah or something.
Right.
You could have been John. But you always had to use those names when speaking on the phones and stuff. So they were very aware of any surveillance that was being put on them down there on the Costa, despite the connections they had. And we later learned the Kinahan organisation had a couple of cops in their pocket, etc. But that's where that comes from. And sometimes when they were talking to one another, other people wouldn't know what the real name was. They would just know them as this sort of fake name. And they operated in cell structures, which was very useful if anybody was caught, because they wouldn't know what other cells were doing.
Yeah.
So you were kind of minimizing the risk of the dismantling of the organisation. But that's where that came from, and it stuck. So...
yeah, well, I suppose we don't know if it's worked or not, because I mean, the Kinahan...
just gets called Kieran Sam.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, the cartel have, I suppose elements of them being caught every so often. So, I mean, obviously there's areas where they haven't been caught. So, I'm sure it works to a point. But I mean, if full surveillance comes on you, it doesn't matter what you call yourself, or if you start changing your hair color every day, it's not going to really matter. I mean, it can throw off a Sunday World photographer and journalist pretty easily. But I think when you're getting into kind of national surveillance units, like from around the world, who are, used to dealing with Islamic terrorists, with, homegrown terrorists and right-wing and left-wing extremists, whatever, people who have, training and that kind of, that spycraft, that, this kind of stuff, I suppose it's going to reassure somebody at the very least. If you're part of a criminal gang and your boss starts insisting that you call yourself Mr. Blue or Mr. Green, it's going to be a little bit impressive that you're somehow protecting yourselves from people talking about you, or from, informants, or from surveillance and so on. But in the end, it's I'm sure people keep forgetting.
In the French case, because O'Sullivan was named in a French court, in papers relating to Encrochat, is that right?
Yeah, that was your story now. So you should.
I'm trying to remember. My brain is so full. I'm traveling in the wrong direction.
No,
these days.
it was himself and Noctar were both mentioned as being kind of significant suppliers to
and
French
in
gangland.
France is the supply of those. I think from memory, the French police were anxious to not only go after the people who were using the Encrochat phones, but to go after the salespeople.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's been out before. Like, you know, that they were keen on. I suppose they might have different legislation that they were able to say, look, these people knew well who they were selling the phones to, and knew well exactly what they were going to be used for. So no more than if you sell somebody a gun, you know, it's a serious crime. You can't say, well, I didn't know what he was going to do with a gun. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if you're giving an encrypted phone system to a drug dealer, you know exactly what he's going to do with it, or she.
So we can sort of surmise that he might not be in France then.
Well, I'd suggest he's probably not in France. Might be a bit too easy. I'm going
to punt on Dubai.
They claim that he was in Spain, yeah, but I imagine somewhere like Dubai is probably perfect, or Azerbaijan, obviously, where he's been before, or any of these kind of countries where there's no, you know, you're going to have a bit of protection from corrupt officials or from a government that is happy to ignore you once you have money.
And we have spoken to many people who knew Kieran Sam O'Sullivan growing up and who have been stunned by the revelations and by his name coming out in this whole Kinahan enterprise. He seemed to have been somebody who was educated and could have gone any direction he wanted in life. Yeah. Clever.
There's a kind
very
of
well liked.
Yeah, I mean, there's a parallel there with Christy Kinahan Senior,
there is,
isn't there?
And maybe that is the connection. Maybe that is why that sort of familiarity grew between them. But nonetheless, an interesting story. And there's Robert Noctor. I'm sure he didn't think he was going to be looking at himself staring out of a picture from news media. Okay, Eamon, thank you very much.
Always a pleasure, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.